Hi everyone, I'm Itivuttaka and welcome to the second of our 4 talks on the Itivuttaka, so it was said. And last week we looked at the first chapter, the chapter of the ones in the Itivuttaka this week. Second week we're looking at the chapter of the twos. We're very sensible like that. Now, I went over last week the background to the text. And we looked at a bit of its place in the scope of Buddhist scriptures and the Pali canon, and a bit at the historical background to it, and so on. So I won't recap all of those things this week. Instead, I'll just get right down to it, and we'll start out by reading a sutta or two. Let's start at the beginning. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one, that is what I heard. Mendicants, when a mendicant has 2 qualities, they live unhappily in the present life, with distress, anguish and fever, and when the body breaks up after death, they can expect a bad rebirth. What 2? Not guarding the sense doors and eating too much. When a mendicant has these 2 qualities, they live unhappily in the present life with distress, anguish and fever, and when the body breaks up after death, they can expect a bad rebirth. That's what the Buddha said. On this it is said, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and likewise mind, a mendicant who leaves these sense doors unguarded, immoderate in eating, sense faculties unrestrained, reaps suffering both physical and mental. Burning in body, burning in mind, by day or night, such a person lives in suffering. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. All right, so the Buddha is beginning, we're leaving behind the section which deals there is this one thing, and now we're into a section dealing with the 2 things of binaries. And here, I shouldn't really say that actually in the first one, when this is not really kind of a binary opposite, but rather a pair of qualities which are essential or very helpful for monastics in particular. Just by way of a note, I'm reading from my own translations, and I'm using the word mendicant here to translate bhikkhu, as I usually do in my translations, and I apologize if the word mendicant feels a little bit, it's not perhaps the most euphonious of renderings. The reason for using the word mendicant is firstly because it's very literal translation. The word bhikkhawe is to do with the practice of wandering for alms from door to door and seeking alms. So by translating it as mendicant, we recall that original context. And I think sometimes in translation it's important to do that because you need to push back against what sometimes are the modern perceptions of the words that we're translating. So, for example, in this particular case, in Sri Lanka, bhikkhu is often translated as priest. And that's not a completely inaccurate translation in terms of the role that bhikkhus play in modern Sri Lankan society. When the English were there, obviously that was the analogue that they had. They saw priests. They probably, I'm just guessing here, but I'm guessing that there weren't so many of the mendicant and renunciate orders of Christianity present in Sri Lanka. And sort of that example of having renunciate monks was not so much there, and certainly mendicant monks. So in Sri Lanka, modern Sri Lanka, of course, the practice of going for alms has largely vanished or become very marginalised. In Thailand and Myanmar, it's still going strong, as it is in Harris Park. So I think it's important just to remember that's the root of the word. That's what it means, is the mendicant. So that's one reason for doing it. The other reason for doing it is because of using gendered terminology. One of the things which has been pointed out by a number of scholars in recent years is that the Pali uses a default masculine gender in a way which has become less common or less acceptable in modern English. So, for example, there's a number of cases where there clearly are bhikkhus and bhikkhunis present in the audience at the teaching, and yet the teaching is addressed only to the bhikkhus. So the the term bhikkhu in this case, as can be attested from a number of examples through the canon, is not meant to be exclusive. It doesn't mean just the male monastics, it means everybody. The other option to translate bhikkhu was monastic, and that was a contender, and that's often what we refer to ourselves today if we're using a gender-neutral term. The reason I didn't choose monastic is partly, again, because it's less literal. The word actually means mendicant. It doesn't. Monastic means one who lives in a monastery. Whereas living in a monastery is not really how a bhikkhu or bhikkhuni was defined in those days. It was defined by your livelihood, that you lived on alms and by accepting what was given. Obviously, again, over time, it came to be the fact that bhikkhus and bhikkhunis almost always lived in monasteries. Yet that doesn't have to be the case. There was a large kind of wandering lifestyle and so on. So monastic, I felt, was a little bit less precise than mendicant. Anyway, so here the Buddha is talking about a couple of the important foundations for the mendicant lifestyle: sense restraint and not eating too much. And these are things which we find right throughout the suttas so many times, and are a fundamental part of the Buddhist practice. Now, just briefly to recap what these things are, by sense restraint, the Buddha does not mean that you shouldn't see things, hear things, smell, taste, and touch things. In fact, he discussed that idea and criticized it rather scathingly elsewhere. But rather, it's about having a degree of mindfulness and a degree of self-control and a degree of restraint regarding how we use our senses. And this is something that we largely forget or largely ignore these days. And we obviously live in a world where sensual stimulation is maximized, and to a degree that was unthinkable in the past days with advertising and the internet and all of these kinds of things. And so there's if you see people, for example, if you see people using even something which seems innocuous, like using social media or something like that, and you're kind of flipping through images and memes and things that people have been sharing, and you can see, it's almost kind of shocking to see how many images that people consume on a daily basis. And if we kind of think back, even when I was a child, to see images and pictures was something that was somewhat occasional, right? You see maybe in the newspaper, or if we watch television or something. And then a generation before that, then it was very rare to see these things. Mostly, the sights that you saw were the things that were around you. The walls here, the flowers, the sky, the people that were near. And those things themselves can be quite stimulating, but compared to what we see on the internet, then they are very boring most of the time, not all that exciting. So what we've done through technology and social media and the internet and so on is that we have created a pipeline for filtering out any kind of non-stimulating images, all of the boring things, and only having the most beautiful, enticing, seductive images, and amplifying those as much as possible, using any kind of fakery that we possibly can, and then pumping that out into the world. And this, of course, is very much like the same process that the traditional story of Siddhartha, when he was living at the home and went forth and saw the three signs of the old man, the sick man, the dead man. And, again, we asked ourselves these questions, how often do we see those things in things like social media posts on Instagram or whatever? How often do people photograph people who are sick or people who are old? And so we have this kind of filter to create a world where we're constantly being stimulated and overstimulated by this deluge of images. And of course, that has an effect on our minds. Of course it's distracting. Of course it's disturbing. Of course it amplifies desire. That's the point. And the engineers who built Facebook and built Instagram and the engineers who build the advertising that Google makes its money from and all of these things, they know all of this stuff. That's how they built their billions of dollars. They built it by enticing people's desire and ever amplifying desire, but never satisfying it. That's the point. That's how you do it. You figure out, oh, there's a little surge of dopamine from this post. I've got a little surge of dopamine, that's good. Oh, but it's not enough. I need more. Next one. Ah, that's good, but I need more. Next one. Ah, that's good, but I need more. I need more, I need more, I need more. And it never, ever stops. That's how our world works. And the only way to stop it is by closing it, by turning away, by just not engaging with it. That's not to say that, again, that these things are absolutes, that they're black and white, that you have to do one or do the other. Again, the Buddha didn't say that you shouldn't see things, but exercise a bit of restraint. Ask yourselves, well, what do I need? What's actually important? And if we think like that, then we realize that actually much of our lives has been devoted to chasing sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch in a way that's actually kind of meaningless. Who cares at the end of the day? What good does it do you? The next closely related one is the problem of overeating. And again, we can see that this is something which has been sort of amplified tremendously since the Buddha's day. When you look at these things in the suttas and you think, wow, like in those days, like what kind of food did they have, right? I mean, you couldn't just order a pizza. You had what, from our perspective, would have probably been a fairly limited range of foods. I mean, they did have curries, so there's that. There's archaeological evidence of ginger and cumin and things like that go back 1,000 years before the Buddha. So they had spices, and there's plenty of tasty spices talked about in the Vinaya. Venerable Dhammika is doing the course on the life of the Buddha, but he's also doing research on the foods available in the time of the Buddha, and hopefully when that's ready, he'll do another course on that. There's basil and garlic and no chilies, unfortunately, they came later, but peppers, onions, lots of tasty things to eat. Ghee, honey. So I could keep on going for quite some time. So while it was somewhat simple from our perspective, still there was obviously a lot of tasty food around. The area that the Buddha was living in the Ganges Valley, is a very fertile area. If you travel around there, you can see that there's this floodplain with very rich soil, and producing food I don't think was ever really too much of a problem. We don't hear about like widespread or long-term famine and poverty in the Buddha's day in the same way that we expect to see today in that area. Of course, there were famines because of the weather or whatever, but it wasn't like a chronic ongoing condition. So the temptation became to overeat, and especially in monastic life, because, well, you don't have that much else to get excited about. And if you read in the suttas and the Vinaya, there's quite a lot of emphasis on the practice of restraint, especially when going into the village for alms round. Because very often the monks and the nuns would stay most of the time in the monastery or in the forest or in seclusion, and going into the village was the most exciting event of the day. And so when you went there, then you had to keep your restraint, you had to keep, don't be ogling, pretty boys or pretty girls, don't be hanging around special extra time at the gulab jamun shop because, you really like gulab jamun, but you just go evenly to the different houses and accept whatever people want. And then to eat enough to sustain your body and to live comfortably. The Buddha did not want his community to suffer. He didn't expect them to starve, and he didn't expect them to do extreme practices when it comes to food and to eating. If people offer the food, then you can eat it. But just don't make too much of a big deal about it. It's okay. And we can be grateful and appreciative to the food, use it for sustaining ourselves, living a healthy life and practicing well, but without getting too obsessed and too caught up in the food that we're eating. Okay. So there are a few other suttas in the twos which are similar, and I will skip ahead a few and just read another very simple sutta. This one is called Ethics. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one. This is sutta number 32 for those who are reading. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one. That is what I heard. Mendicants, a person with two qualities is cast down to hell. What two? Bad conduct and bad view. A person who has these two qualities is cast down to hell. That is what the Buddha said. On this it is said, if a person possesses these two qualities, bad conduct and bad views, when the body breaks up, that witless person is reborn in hell. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. All right. So here we have the division of the two things, the bad conduct and the bad views. One inner, one outer. And both of these lead to a bad destiny. So the Buddha here is not optimistic about about your expectations if you're doing badly in these two areas. So what does it mean when the Buddha was talking about being cast down to hell? So in Buddhism, one of the fundamental Buddhist teachings is that there is this thing called rebirth, that we exist in our life, and during our life we make choices, we have experiences, and the things that we do in our life matter. Right? The choices that we make in our life affect us and they affect the people around us, and we can see that, in a sense, that our choices have shaped the world that we live in this life. That's not to say that external forces are irrelevant. Obviously, there are social and cultural forces which are going to impact that in great ways as well. And this is something that we understand in a social sense through understanding the processes of like class and discrimination and privilege and so on. So for myself as an Australian, I was brought up in a developed country. I'm a white person, so usually at the top of most systems of racial privilege. I was born in a reasonably well-to-do middle-class family. I had a good education at a private school, and I'm a man, so I get to go at the top of most of the systems of ranks and privilege that there are in the world. Being an Australian, of course, bumps me down perhaps a little bit, so that would tend to rank me a bit lower, but still, in the eyes of Englishmen or something like that, then we're still colonials. So we're not quite at the top of the heap in terms of the social pecking order, and then that of course gives me a lot of advantages and gives me a lot of privileges to allow me to pursue things in my life that I wouldn't have if my life had been otherwise. And a lot of times I can see in my life that I can see that choices that I would have made were made quite lightly and quite blithely because of that privilege, which I didn't really recognize at the time. For example, going to Thailand and traveling alone. Right? I mean, I never really bothered me. If I'd been a woman doing that, then that would have been much more dangerous, and I would have had to take that much more carefully. And so there's so many examples of things like that where, yes, my choices are shaping my life, but they're not shaping that independently of the social conditions within which I found myself. Right? So we interrelate, the personal choices interrelate with the wider choices of our society. But nevertheless, it still remains the fact that even in the worst of situations, we still have a choice about how we respond to those situations. So understanding that social and cultural, economic, racial, and other forces will help to construct the choices that are available to us does not in any way remove our own responsibility for ethical choices. Everybody is put in a situation where they're conditioned by outside forces. That's how ethics works. The questions of ethics is, how do we respond to the situation that we are in? If, like me, you're in a position of privilege, then your responsibility is to use that to try to help those who are less privileged. Use that to try to reach out and speak out about injustice and so on, and to try to undo the privilege which is unfairly allowed you to make those choices, or to extend those, make it possible for others to have those choices. So, but if we make bad choices, we're not just creating the world that we're living in here, but we're also creating the conditions for the next life as well. So if we make good choices, we create conditions for a good life in the future. We make bad choices, we make conditions for a bad life in the future. And those futures that we live in are created by the choices that we make. In exactly the same way that the presence that we live in now has been created by choices that we make. It's not some kind of mysterious thing, right? It's not when the law of karma is not invoking some metaphysical principle. It's pointing to the fact that we can see that the choices that we're making shape the lives that we live. That's all. That's the whole point of the doctrine of karma. So that continues after life, and there are different places and different realms and so on where one can go to, just as there are in this life. When teaching the suttas, I find it very useful to invoke a framework of 4 different perspectives on the suttas. That is 4 different ways of looking at the text. That is the literal, the metaphorical, the literal, the moral, is the second one, the metaphorical, and the transcendental. And this group of 4 perspectives I learned from a rabbi. We once did an interfaith dialogue, and she talked about this and talked about how this was something which had been developed in the tradition of Torah interpretation. And I think it's a very wonderful framework for looking at ancient scriptures, including Buddhist scriptures, because it mitigates and it guards against reductive readings of scriptures. What we tend to find is that different groups of people with different purposes will use one or other of these kinds of readings. So, for example, the literal reading is typically that pursued by scholars and academics, that you want to figure out exactly what the words are, what the words mean, how they relate to each other, what the grammar is, and what the fundamental basic meaning of a particular text is. So that literal reading is incredibly important because everything else is built from that. At the same time, the danger, of course, is that if you only have a literal reading of it, then you tend to have a view of ancient text which is at the best impoverished and narrow and thin, and at the worst is rigid and fundamentalist and dogmatic. And this is the danger if you have only a literal reading of things. The second kind of reading of text, second aspect, is the moral aspect. The moral aspect is what's usually done by Dhamma teachers, by monks and nuns, by people who are trying to shape and improve people's lives. So we teach about this is what you should do, this is what you should not do. Just as, for example, the previous teaching we were looking at, we should practice sense restraint. We should not get distracted too much by things that we see through things that we perceive through sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And we should practice moderation in eating and avoid eating too much. So this is a moral lesson which gives a practical response that people can make and actually change their lives about it. It's something that you can see that second piece of cake on your plate and think, no, hang on, one piece of cake was enough, and it will actually practically change the way that you live your life. So this is the moral meaning of the text. So now the advantage of the moral perspective, of course, is that it can directly and practically improve people's lives. However, the disadvantage of it is that if we overly focus on the moral meaning of the text, what tends to happen is that, first of all, that teachers and people who are transmitting the texts are more using it in order to convey their own moral judgments than they are in helping people to understand what it is that the text is actually about. So we sort of skip over what the thing is actually saying to what I think you should do, and it becomes like a disguised way of telling people what you think, how you think that they should be living their lives. So this, I think, is one kind of problem. And the other kind of problem is that a moral teaching in this kind of sense is about management and about tweaking things around the edges. It's about getting by a little bit better in the world. And if we only focus on that aspect of things, then we lose the power and the transformative potential of the Buddha's teachings. It becomes something that we can use to, stop people from drinking, and we can tell a story about why people shouldn't drink, and so on and so forth. And look, that's good, and properly integrated, that's part of the Noble Eightfold Path. But there's more to the Dhamma than that. And if we feel that every time that we have to teach, that we have to be moralizing at people, then it's not a very rich, it's not a very fertile way of approaching things. So this is something that I feel personally, my own personal response is that I feel often a bit constricted or a bit reluctant when people ask me, what's the practical application of this? Because, to be honest, the practical application of these things is often dead obvious, especially when it comes to the suttas. I mean, the suttas, the moral and the ethical lesson is often entirely clear and explicit, as again, for example, with the suttas that we just looked at. Don't eat too much and practice sense restraint. It's not that complicated. And so sometimes the desire, of course, it's important that things have a practical implication, but the assumption behind that is often that somehow the suttas have some obligation to be relevant for me in my life here and now. Do you see the problem? Actually, the suttas don't have any obligation like that at all. Maybe it actually isn't relevant. Maybe where you are in your practice is something completely else. Maybe if the Buddha was speaking to you, he would have spoken on something else entirely. So there's no particular guarantee that any particular passage is meaningful or relevant in a practical way to you. But if you insist that it must be, then you, in a sense, are reducing the potential and the possibility for transformation and a more meaningful response to things. So I always advise people to not be in too much of a rush to interpret a moral meaning from things. The other thing that happens is that when you're in a rush to interpret the moral meaning for things, you tend to be translating that moral meaning into something which fits within your own set of values. And so you start to not listen to what the thing is actually saying, because since you've already assumed that it has to be relevant for what you want to do now, then if it's not, then it must mean something else. And so you get into a habit of twisting the meaning of things in a way that is congenial to whatever your set of values may be. To counteract that, this is why the literal meaning is important, because when we look at the literal meaning of things, we set aside those questions of practical import. A scholar who studies the Pali texts doesn't necessarily think that this has any practical application to their own life. And that gives them the freedom to look at it without thinking, this says don't kill. But I need to kill those cockroaches in my kitchen. Therefore, how do I get around that? Do you see the point? You can say, well, the text actually is saying don't kill. Your moral response to that is something which is quite independent. So the point here is not that the practical or the moral response to it is unimportant. Obviously it is. The point is that we should take our time to listen to what the text is actually saying. And we should use our wisdom to understand what are the moral messages and moral lessons that we should be taking away from it in our time and our place. So this is the moral of the story. The third aspect is the creative and metaphorical response to a text. Now, what do I mean by a creative response to it? Well, it could be anything. Metaphorical response to it, literally, you can take one text and have it mean anything you like. It might mean making a painting about it. It might mean writing a poem about it. It might mean taking a single word and interpreting it in an entirely new way and drawing an entire new meaning out of it. The possibilities are literally endless. And it is from creative responses to Scripture that we see a very large portion of the creative traditions throughout Asia over the last 2,500 years. We see the artworks in temples, or the plays which have been put on for telling stories from Scripture and so on. Or we see the long stories, say Jataka stories and things, which were developed out of small kernels found in the Suttas. And on it goes. And so that creative spark, or the things like Buddha images, another great example, right? So that creative response to Scripture to try to express something in some way. So a Buddha image like this very beautiful Thai-style image, which we have recently been gifted here at the Lokanta Vihara. So thanks to Ayeshe and the Sydney supporters for giving us a Buddha Rupa. This beautiful Buddha image, this is not like a literal representation of what the Buddha physically looked like. It's inspired by the ennobling qualities depicted by the Buddha and expressing that in human form, mediated through certain cultures and technologies and personal skills and so on. So that kind of creative response to the Scriptures is always a part of a tradition, it's always part of a people, it's always part of individuals. If we lose that, we become rigid, we become fundamentalist, and we become dogmatic. We're only insisting on the literal meaning, or maybe just the literal and the moral meaning of things, and we're not allowing that to spark some kind of joy and spark some kind of wonder. So whereas like a literal meaning or even a moral meaning tend to close down meaning, tend to narrow a perspective, then a creative response opens up that perspective. And to be clear, by creative response, I don't mean just artworks and so on, although that's an important dimension of it. It can be just an interpretation or a reading. It can be a way of seeing a principle or an idea in a Scripture which is used in one way and thinking, well, actually that same thing can be used in another way as well, right? So these kind of creative interpretations. And we see this right from the start of the suttas. For example, there's numerous cases where the Buddha teaches a verse in one place, and then in another place, then that verse is taken up for discussion. People say, well, what was the Buddha talking about? And then there'll be a discussion and different points of view and perspectives about how to actually read and interpret that verse. And sometimes those perspectives are not very closely linked to the actual root meaning of the word at all. A typical example is one sutta where a mendicant is described as being anoko, literally without a home. And in the context of the original verse, it fairly clearly means, in a literal sense, of somebody who's gone forth from their home to live the homeless life. And yet, in the interpretation, it's described as being someone who's free of the sense of self and free of attachment to conceit. And the Buddha was happy with that, and he praised that and said it's a good interpretation. So that creative response to Scripture is there from the beginning. It's inherent in the nature of Scripture. And it's not the case that we should or can reduce our ancient Scripture to just one thing with one set of meanings. The downside of the creative or metaphorical response to things is that if we overemphasize or misuse that perspective, then we lose a groundedness as to what the thing was talking about. Think about it in terms of just a practical example. You're at home, your partner gives you a call and says, "Oh, do we need anything in the kitchen? Oh, yeah, we're missing we need some bread. If you could pick up a loaf of bread on the way home, that would be great. No worries." And then driving along the road thinking, "Wow, pick up a loaf of bread." That's a metaphor for just the insatiability of desire, right? I mean, we've eaten so many loaves of bread through our lives. Every day we're having bread, and we've eaten so many loaves, and we're still not satisfied. We just need more. It's never enough. We just need to keep on consuming more and more and having more and more. And while you're occupied with this train of thought, you arrive home, and then your partner says, "Well, where's the bread?" You say, "Well, look, it's such a great metaphor, but you still need to eat. The bread is still bread. It's not just a metaphor for bread." So the metaphor for things doesn't replace the thing itself. And so this is something which is very common to see in modern interpretations of scriptures, because people will find that there are things talked about in the scriptures, such as an obvious example being the idea of rebirth, and they don't agree with that. It conflicts with their ideas. But rather than questioning their own ideas, rather than scrutinizing them and allowing the possibility that maybe it's their own ideas which need to be expanded, then it's easier to simply say, "Oh, well, it's a metaphor," and we can reduce it and we can explain it away. And it's a way of failing to actually grapple with the reality of things. So metaphorical readings should never displace literal readings, and they should never displace moral readings. They can enhance them. They can provide a more creative response to them and a rich response to those things, but they don't replace them. So this is something which you can use as a way of testing these things. So just a simple example of this, in the Visuddhimagga course, we talked about dependent origination, and in dependent origination, you have, for example, the idea of birth. And birth is defined in dependent origination as the coming into being and emergence from the womb and so on. It means like physical birth. Old age is defined as physical old age, the breaking of the teeth, the graying of the hair, wrinkling of the skin. This is the old age. So now, can we use, say, old age as a metaphor for other things? Well, obviously, yes, of course we can, right? It's a universal thing, and we can apply it in all kinds of ways. But it doesn't obviate the fact that in the context of dependent origination, jara means old age. Jati means birth in the sense, the normal sense that we use. So that when you see somebody who's using a metaphorical approach to dismiss a clearly literal meaning, then this is a red flag. This is somebody who's not listening to what the teachings are saying to them anymore, but somebody who has already got an idea of what they understand and is using some kind of method to explain it away. So this is the metaphorical meaning. And finally, there's the transcendent meaning. And the transcendent meaning in the Torah tradition, which is where this system of interpretation came from, means how the scripture connects you with God or relates to God. For Buddhists, then it's about how it connects to Nibbana and the path to Nibbana. So our scriptures, our texts, are not something that we read because they are good texts, because they are linguistically interesting because they have a good meaning and so on. They're not something that we read just because they give us handy life advice and get us to live in a good way and not live in a bad way. They're not something we read just because they have can inspire a metaphorical and creative response to them. They're something which leads to the transcendence of suffering. And all of those other aspects are things which are part of that. So reading the scriptures and trying to understand what they mean in and of themselves in a literal way is something which contributes to that path to Nibbana. Applying them in your life in a practical way through living a moral and good life, then this is also part of that path to Nibbana. Exercising your mind in a metaphorical and creative response to scripture, to figuring out new and unexpected relationships and ideas, this is also part of that path to Nibbana. So everything that we're doing within the Buddhist context has that transcendental perspective and that transcendental dimension. So I mentioned before, when the literal meaning tends to be that pursued by scholars and academics, the moral meaning by monastics or Dhamma teachers, the creative response is usually emphasized by artists, and the transcendental response is, I'm not sure, is there a group of people who tend to use that response? But certainly it's quite common in like meditative circles and in spiritual circles. And again, if used in the wrong way, it can be harmful because it becomes what we can call elevationism. Now, elevationism is the opposite of reductionism. So reductionism is that whatever happens, then you reduce it to the lowest common denominator, right? So, for example, if you see a monk teaching people about generosity, then you assume that they're only doing that because they want to get lots of stuff. This is a reductive approach to it. An elevationist response takes the opposite perspective. And we see that a lot in spiritual circles, like a lot. It's very, very, very common. And people will take some kind of truth and then elevate it to a kind of a meaningless level, which allows them to ignore the realities and the practicalities of the situation. We're seeing that playing out in our wider society as I'm speaking, particularly with the idea of all lives matter that people say these days. So when the Black Lives Matter movement started, then there was pointing to a reality, a lived reality of black people's lives that, from the perspective of law enforcement and the perspective of the state and the perspective of the society in which they lived, that their lives didn't matter. Sometimes didn't matter at all, or certainly didn't matter as much as other people's lives. So we need to point to that and to emphasize the fact that Black lives matter. Then, of course, other people will respond and say, well, all lives matter. But all lives matter, obviously in one sense is true, but it's very problematic. Why? Well, first of all, it's problematic because it's so condescending. By saying that, then people, typically white people, are assuming that that the people who are talking about the Black Lives Matter don't get that they're saying, nobody in Black Lives Matter is saying only Black Lives Matter. They're saying Black Lives Matter as well. And so it's this condescending attitude that we have a higher moral perspective and it's our job to be teaching other people, teaching black people about why their morality is defective. So this is one problem with it. The other problem is that, and this has increasingly come to be the case, is that it's used quite consciously in order to deflect attention from the actual issues. So that elevationist approach, it looks like it's a higher moral perspective. It's not just the lives of one particular group that matter, it's everyone's lives that matter. It's a higher moral perspective. And yet it's actually used as a tool in order to get you to avoid looking at the things that really matter. That's elevationism, and that's really common in Buddhism. And we see this all the time when people will say, that why are you talking about bhikkhuni ordination, then Nibbana doesn't have any gender, for example. So this is a way of avoiding the actual lived experience of individuals who actually experience suffering because of the conditions in society. And we can't change that because in some imagined world, that problem isn't there. I wish I lived in that imagined world. I wish I lived in a world where race didn't matter and where gender didn't matter. And hear the police siren going on now. I wish I lived in a world where we didn't need to have police and all of these things were not an issue. I wish we did, but we don't. We live in this world and these things do matter. And it's important that we do not use our spiritual teachings to somehow pretend from our higher plane and higher perspective that the actual suffering and lived experience of others doesn't matter. All right, so this is some summary of these four perspectives: the literal, the moral, the metaphorical, and the transcendental. All of these perspectives are valuable. All of them have a role to play. All of them complement and support each other. And when we're reading an ancient scripture and engaging with it, we should be asking ourselves, well, you know, which of these perspectives are we looking at? Can we enrich that perspective by looking at it in another way? Which perspective are we missing out on? And if we look at the differences between people who are sometimes advocating for different readings and different interpretations, then often those differences can be understood. Oh, this person's talking about a literal meaning, this person's talking about a metaphorical meaning. They're not necessarily conflicting, but what is conflicting is assuming that one and only one reading is the right way. Actually, there are multiple ways of looking at things, and all of those ways can enrich us. So let's come back to the Itivuttaka and let's read a couple more suttas before we finish. So I'll read, this is a sutta called Thoughts, number 38. And this was said by the Buddha, the perfected one, that is what I heard. Two thoughts, mendicants, often occur to the realized one, the perfected one, the fully awakened Buddha. The thought of sanctuary and that of seclusion. The realized one loves kindness and delights in it, so this thought often occurs to him. Through this behavior I shall not hurt any creature, firm or frail. The realized one loves seclusion and delights in it, so this thought often occurs to him. What is unskillful has been given up. So mendicants, you too should love kindness and delight in it. Then the thought will often occur to you, through this behavior I shall not hurt any creature, firm or frail. You too should love seclusion and delight in it. Then this thought will often occur to you. What is unskillful? What is not given up? What should I give up? That is what the Buddha said. On this it is said, and so these, of course, the verses that follow each sutta. Two thoughts occur to him, the realized one, the bearer of the unbearable. The thought of the sanctuary was the first to be stated, seclusion was the second made clear. Dispeller of darkness, the great hermit has crossed over, the attained, the master, the undefiled. In the midst of it all, he is freed in the ending of craving. That sage bears his final body. He has disposed of Mara, I declare, and gone beyond old age. Standing high on a rocky mountain, you can see the people all around. In just the same way, the all-seer, wise one, having ascended the temple of truth, being free of sorrow, looks at these people swamped with sorrow, oppressed by rebirth and old age. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. All right, so it's a very beautiful sutta, somewhat more developed, more poetic than some of the ones we've looked at earlier, but like all of the ones we've looked at in the Itivuttaka so far, dealing with fundamental and core teachings and principles of the Dhamma, things which are found commonly elsewhere throughout the suttas. A couple of just notes, again, to clarify the literal reading of things. When I'm talking about the word, I'm using the word sanctuary. This is a somewhat new translation or less used translation. The Pali word is the yoga kema, and the word kema probably meant originally something like an oasis. It seems to be a word that was derived perhaps from the old Indo-Europeans who were traveling across the deserts, traveling across the wastelands with their caravan and their beasts and their people, and then after a hard day on the trail, you come to a place where there was some water, some trees, some shade, and you could release the horses and the oxen from their yoga, from their bonds, their harness, and they could wander freely and relax, and then you could bathe, enjoy a meal, tell stories around the campfire. And this is kind of the original idea that yoga came from. And the Buddha used it as a synonym for nibbana. So the Buddha here encouraging us to love kindness and to delight in kindness, to do things that will not hurt any creature, firm or frail. The Buddha's ethics and his morality is very consciously a universal one. It is not an anthropocentric morality. It's not based around human life and the value of human life. It's based around the value of all life or all sentient beings, as we so often say in Buddhism. And one of the things that this particular sutta does is it connects those very simple ideas, the thoughts of kindness and thoughts of seclusion, with that transcendental state of being the Tathagata, being the realized one. This again is very characteristic of Buddhism, that our very exalted language, our sometimes abundant and florid expressions of faith and devotion in the Buddha is devotion towards an ideal of a human being who simply let go of greed, hate and delusion, who simply developed good qualities in their heart, qualities that we too possess. And that nature of the Dhamma is quite an extraordinary distinguishing feature, I think, of Buddhism. Okay, so we're getting a little bit near the end, and so I will skip over some of the remaining suttas, but there of course are a lot of beautiful suttas here, and I'll go to one of the rather more famous suttas in this passage. This is shared with the Udana, and it's teaching on the unconditioned. There is, mendicants, an unborn, unproduced, unmade, and unconditioned. If there were no unborn, unproduced, unmade, and unconditioned, then you would find no escape here from the born, produced, made, and conditioned. But since there is an unborn, unproduced, unmade, and unconditioned, an escape is found from the born, produced, made, and conditioned. That is what the Buddha has said. On this it is said, what's born, produced, and arisen, made, conditioned, not lasting, wrapped in old age and death, frail, a nest of disease generated by food, and the conduit to rebirth, that's not fit to delight in. The escape from that is peaceful, beyond the scope of reason, everlasting, unborn, and unarisen, the sorrowless, stainless state, the cessation of all painful things, the stilling of conditions, bliss. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. All right, so obviously this sutta is giving us a very striking and powerful statement about the reality of nibbana and the nature of nibbana as the stilling of conditions. The point of the sutta, before going to the point of the sutta, before going to the moral of the sutta, let me just spend a little bit of time on the literal meaning. First thing to notice about the literal expression of it is it has a very kind of dramatic rhetorical form. The line starts with ati, there is, and then goes ajatang, abhutang, akatang, asankatang. There is an unborn, unmade, unproduced, unconditioned. So there is, and then a series of negatives, un. Right? And this is very characteristic of the Buddha's approach to talking about nibbana. And to sum it up, we can say when the Buddha talked about Nibbana, he was ontologically negative and psychologically positive. So by ontologically negative, what I mean is that his statements about the beingness, the existence of Nibbana were always negative. So here the Buddha is emphatically affirming a series of negatives. There is the not, the not, the not, the not. But psychologically, he's painting it in these very beautiful conditions, peaceful, beyond the scope of reason, everlasting, and so on and so forth. Sorrowless, stainless, the sorrowless, stainless state. So he wants to entice us towards this thing, but it isn't there. Now, of course, in reading this, I'm just seeing if there's any other. Just one other literal point before going on. One of the terms in the verses there I've translated as the conduit to rebirth. The Pali phrase is the bhavaneti. Bhavaneti is a difficult term to translate. Neti means some sort of leader or guide or something like that, or a conduit. Bhava means existence or life. So the bhavaneti is basically craving, which is that which leads us to a new life. So that, again, the sort of basic or literal meaning of it is pretty straightforward, but to express it, the idea in English is a bit hard. And also I suspect, I've never really been able to prove, but I suspect that there's a metaphor in there to do with the idea of the umbilical cord. I think this is what the idea is, that our craving is like this kind of cord that's connecting us from one life to the next. One of the reasons for thinking that is because some of the accounts that people have given of their experiences of seeing rebirth and seeing the process of rebirth is sometimes manifest in people's minds in this kind of way, that they can actually see in their meditation a cord, like a light, a string of light or a rope of light that's connecting them from this life to a next life. So it's actually like the metaphor is literally perceived in the mind in that kind of way. And I suspect that that's what this idea of bhavaneti is about. I can't really prove that. There's not really enough, I haven't found any sort of distinctive context to be able to say it. In the suttas, it's just defined as being craving. So the conduit to existence. All right, so obviously this particular passage has been used time and again by people who want to interpret the suttas in an eternalist way, or want to interpret Nibbana in an eternalist way. And so there's a long history in Buddhism of trying to grapple with what the nature of Nibbana is. Obviously giving up and giving up the experience of Nibbana, giving up the idea that we can live forever and that we can have some kind of state of eternal bliss is a difficult thing for people to give up. And equally, if we say that Nibbana is just the ending and the cessation of the aggregates, then it becomes difficult to say, well, how is that different from annihilationism? So there are genuine problems of interpretation here. And we see a strong tendency in Buddhist history and also in contemporary Buddhism to try to sort of subtly bring back some idea, especially some idea of Nibbana as an eternal place of happiness and bliss. To give another perspective on this, I'm just going to read the final sutta in this section of the Itivuttaka. This is sutta number 49. Let's just read this sutta first before going on. Overcome by two misconceptions, mendicants, some gods and humans get stuck, some overreach, while those with vision see. And how do some get stuck? Because of love, delight, and enjoyment of existence, when the Dhamma is being taught for the cessation of existence, the minds of some gods and humans are not eager, confident, settled, and decided. That's how some get stuck. And I think this is a really important thing to bear in mind. If we're teaching Nibbana and some people are not getting disturbed by it, then it's a sign that something is wrong. People should be disturbed by the idea of Nibbana. The cessation of existence should freak people out, especially if you're attached to your life and your existence and all of the things that you have. And if you're teaching Nibbana in a way that makes it completely user-friendly so nobody gets disturbed by it, you're teaching it wrong. Okay. How do some overreach? That some, being horrified, repelled, and disgusted with existence, delight in ending existence, when this self is annihilated and destroyed, when the body breaks up and doesn't exist after death, that is peaceful, that is sublime, that is reality. That is how some overreach. So this is talking about that idea of vibhava tanha, of the idea that there's a force in our mind which is the flip side of the force of wanting to live eternally and wanting to have a stable eternal existence. The flip side of that is actually, no, actually I just want it to end. I just want us to stop. In a strong form, then this manifests as a suicidal impulse. In lesser forms, it manifests as self-destructive behaviors, addictions and alcoholism and so on, or even just a desire to smoke pot and go to sleep and zone out and just not know, not have, not experience. And when that kind of primal desire that vibhava tanha becomes instantiated as a view, then it becomes the attachment to the view that, well, this life, this physical self is all there is, and then after death there is no more. And I think that obviously, looking at the psychology of it is one thing, but of course in terms of the reality, what happens after death, then I think a reasonable person can come to different ideas. We shouldn't reduce people's ideas about what actually happens after death to their psychology about it. All right? People can distinguish those things, but obviously they're not completely unrelated either. So it's not the case that everyone who believes that there's no such thing as rebirth therefore has crippling vibhava tanha and is unable to conceive of life after life because they just hate life and they're consumed by this existential nihilism, right? I mean, that's ridiculous. On the other hand, it's also ridiculous to say that these things have no influence on our ideas. They have some influence. From a Buddhist point of view, it isn't the critique that materialists often make is that belief in rebirth is simply wishful thinking. But to do that, to make that argument, ignores the actual Buddhist perspective, which is that rebirth is kind of sucks, that it is actually suffering. And to actually long for the release of annihilation is probably a lot more pleasant than taking a chance on where you're going to get reborn in the next life for many people. So this is what, from a Buddhist point of view, both of these two things can be seen as two extremes: the attachment to life and to existence and to ongoing. And then when you hear about the unborn, uncreated nibbana is cessation, then you'll freak out. Good, you should be freaking out. That's a sign that your views are being challenged. If you're freaking out because of things, stay with it. Don't imagine that somehow that feeling there's something wrong with that feeling. That's the feeling of your views and your fundamental principles being stirred up. They need to be stirred up. We need to question these things and to throw them out. You need to go through periods where you're like, what the hell is my life about? What is existence? What is all of this? You need to go through periods when you walk down the street and you look at everything around you and you think none of this means anything at all. And finally, those with vision see. It's when a mendicant, how do those with vision see? When a mendicant sees what has come to be as having come to be. Seeing this means in accordance with dependent origination. What is here, it's real, it's being produced by conditions. Seeing this, they're practicing for disillusionment, dispassion, and cessation regarding what has come to be. That is how those with vision see. So to accept the reality of the conditioned world, which is real and has been produced, and because of that, we can let go of it and practice for Nibbana. Those who see what has come to be as having come to be, transcending what has come to be, are freed in accord with the truth. With the ending of craving for continued existence, they completely understand what has come to be, rid of craving for rebirth in this or that state. With the disappearance of what has come to be, a mendicant does not come back to future lives. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. So this is enough for today. I will leave you with that, and I'll look forward to having a discussion with you in a couple of days and to continue our course on the Itivuttaka.